Okay, recording, microphones there. So this is a response to a bit off the cuff, very off the cuff. I was gonna type out a response, and I thought, you know what, I'll put this in a little video. So this is a response to the worst person on the internet. This isn't me. It's not me saying this person is the worst person on the internet. You understand? That is what they call themselves. What did they used to call themselves? I've forgotten. Jesus Christ, no memory nowadays. You'll recognise them. If you listen to the voice, you'll think, oh, yes, I recognise who they are. So, and can I just say, I'm drinking my home brew. This is my first brew back. Not an unqualified success, it has to be said. What I did, I'm using my own hops. So I kind of fucked it up with the bitterness of the hops, really. But I'm drinking it. I'm persevering nonetheless. So what I did was it should have had about 100 grams of Goldings, which are about 5% alpha acids. I grow my own hops, First Gold. Never brewed with them before because I've had this sort of period away from brewing of about 7 or 8 years. So I assumed, I don't know, First Gold should be about sort of 8% alpha acid, so sort of 1.5 to 2 times the amount of bittering ability. But I assumed, well, that's the commercial growers. Mine will be crap, so I put in 150 grams of First Gold. Really should have put in about 50 grams. So effectively, it's about 3 times. It's probably about it's probably about 110, 120 international bitterness units. It's bitterer than the bitterest thing you've ever tasted. But I'm working on it. The bittering sensation on your tongue kind of takes a hit after a few minutes, and you kind of just persevere with it. Anyway, so what had happened was he made a video and he talked about turfs and turf being used as a pejorative term, and said, how can something be in his view, how can something be a pejorative term if it is accurate, if it is factually accurate? Trans exclusionary radical feminist. If it's factually accurate, how can it be a pejorative? And I responded to that saying, well, there are things that are factually accurate, and I gave some examples, calling a Scottish person Scotch, for example, rather than Scottish. A Pakistani person a Paki, calling somebody who suffers from spasticity, which is it used to be called, a spastic. In fact, in the UK, it used to be called the Spastics Association. These things can nevertheless, calling an obese person obese, these things can nevertheless be seen as pejorative. So that was the argument that I made, and he made a very reasonable response to that, which I've got to take on board. And the response was that there were difference between things which are intrinsic characteristics to the person and things which pertain to your belief or your opinions. And I agree with that. It's a fair point, that. And so whereas these other things are intrinsic characteristics, they're things you cannot leave behind, you cannot get away from. Being a radical feminist, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, these pertain to beliefs, and so they are somewhat different, and I agree with that, and I take that on board. But it made me think, and this is why it's maybe more complicated than I could have just left in a comment. In some ways, this is very similar to the discussion that takes place with regard to protected characteristics in the United Kingdom. The idea that protected characteristics generally pertain to those things which are intrinsic to the person. Okay, so sexuality, race, gender stroke sex, all these kinds of things, ability stroke disability, all these things are protected characteristics. But then there is this oddity there, right, which is religion, which is another protected, or lack of religion, belief or lack of belief in a god or deity. And it kind of muddies the water. Something I mentioned before that kind of muddies the water because it takes us away. It is different. Which one of all these things is different to all the other sort of things? And that is the different one. It's interesting. You can be as nasty and as horrible as you like as somebody's political belief, and that's no problem. That's not protected at all. But if it's their religious belief, then that's very, very different. It's a protected characteristic, which is particularly muddy because, of course, religion and politics are quite tightly tied together, and a lot of political beliefs are not only held for religious reasons, but religion sticks more than a toe in the political waters. So effectively, potentially, you could hold a political position for secular reasons, and that's fair game. But if you held it for religious reasons, then it's part of a protected characteristic, potentially. That's something that I've objected to in the past. But nevertheless, it muddies the water. And it kind of muddies the water in the same direction that we were going to here, I think. That's why I wanted to mention that, which is that you have a situation here with regards to trans-exclusionary radical feminism, which is, I suppose you could say, a series of beliefs, opinions, etc., etc. But why shouldn't the same apply? And this is what I've said before. If an opinion, if a belief in something can be hidden behind religion and get that protected status, then why shouldn't a political belief? I know why, practically speaking, because if we did so, we couldn't have political conversations, and I think people recoil from that. They want to try and do this thing to appease different groups, but they realise if political positions are put behind this, and I don't think there's any logical reason not to include political positions if you include religious positions, but you just realise it would just be absolutely fucking untenable to do that. So it's an appeasement. It is a sop to the religious that you cannot extend to those things which are obviously don't have a religious aspect to it. But from a perspective, I still think there is this case that I was making, which effectively what happens is that even things, you have these different things which are technically correct. These are labels which are technically correct. What is the common factor within them is that despite them being technically correct, they start to become used as a pejorative. And of course you have a ladder, don't you? You have words for people with disabilities. Let's talk about intellectual disabilities, which were pejorative terms and have been for some time. So you start creating new terms such as special needs or learning difficulties or things like that. And they in turn then start being used as pejoratives. If you want to take the piss out of someone, you say they're special needs or something along those lines, don't you? And so those titles those terms that have come about to try and avoid the terms that have become pejoratives in themselves become pejoratives, and so you get this sort of churning through of terms. You've seen it with coloured dropped out of fashion, and so we went to other terms, and now we've gone back to, I remember hearing people who are black, right, sub-Saharan African, complaining. What's the football player called? Jesus, I can't think of his name. He used to be on Talk Sport, complaining about coloured as a term, saying coloured. What? I'm not a colour. I'm a person, and yet person of colour is now acceptable again. So that's kind of almost gone full circle. You end up recycling these terms in the end as more and more terms become used as pejoratives. But in terms of the trans-exclusionary radical feminism thing, I kind of understand the point. I think the problem is, this is what, if I want to weed it down, which I do, which is that ultimately I don't see it as a problem in calling, it doesn't matter whether it's a belief or opinion as a religion is, or whether it's some intrinsic factor, whether you have a disability or something like that. I think what's more important is whether there is somewhere else you can go to. So let's say TERF starts to be used as a pejorative. And I think in some contexts it has. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge, that with all these things, it's contextual. They're not intrinsically a pejorative or not, it's the context. But it's whether you have another go-to. And with most of these terms, as we write them off, we provide an alternative. Yeah. And I'm not sure that anybody's providing an alternative for that. And so in some ways that would be more my concern there, which is not that TERFs are saying, well, I don't like the word TERF, it's a pejorative, don't use it. It's that there isn't really an alternative that means the same thing, that you can say, okay, fair enough, have that. All right, you don't want that, I won't use that, I'll use this instead. That's more the problem. If there was one, then why wouldn't you do that? Right? It seems kind of mean-spirited not to do that and to try and play on some technicality rather than to do that. The biggest problem I have actually with the term TERF is that it tends to, I think it's overused, and by which I mean, one thing that the worst person, what's his fucking name? Jesus, what did he used to call himself? Bastard. Cannot remember. The worst person on the internet, something that he was correcting was pinpointing exactly what a TERF is, trans exclusionary radical feminist, is that he pinpointed as part of his analysis that quality of radical feminism, which is the viewpoint on gender, and that particular position on gender. But the problem is that is what defines, or one of the main things that defines radical feminism. The problem I have with TERF is that I've never been called a TERF, right? and not that I have the problems with trans people that would define me as that, but there are lots of people who are obviously not feminists. They're not defined as TERFs, but effectively TERF has been sort of purloined as a term for any feminist who is trans-skeptical in some way. And, of course, that isn't what the term is. It is somebody who is a radical feminist who is trans-exclusionary, not just somebody who is a feminist. And a lot of feminists are not radical feminists. A radical feminist is not an extreme feminist. A radical feminist is a feminist who has certain views with regards to gender theory, which I think effectively regards gender as a social construct, and effectively men and women, males and females, they're all the fucking same really. It's just society that brings these differences out. They're just cultured. They're just brought up to be different, and that human beings magically, unlike every other fucking mammal on the planet, if you just brought them up all the same, the males and females would all be the same as one another for some reason. That is their kind of perspective, and that is effectively, as I see it, one of the things that defines radical feminism. It is that particular perspective on gender. And yeah, I think TERF has been effectively purloined to be just a title that you give to anybody who you may define as a feminist who has some issues with trans people. Okay, I think that's what I wanted to say there. How do I sum all of that lot up? I don't need to sum the last bit up. With regard to the worst person on the internet, still can't think what he's called. I just want to say that, yeah, I take your point on board. You said to me a really interesting thing. I appreciated that right at the end of the comment. You said, God, it's so in tune with how I think about things. You said, you might not agree with me. If you've read this, you might not agree with me, but I hope you'll understand where I'm coming from. And yes, I do. I do understand where you're coming from. And in part, actually, more than that, I do agree with you, but I don't entirely agree with you. And the reason I don't entirely agree with you is that I do see some value. If we're going to look at terms, and we're going to look at terms as pejoratives, I don't really see any reason why, just because something isn't an intrinsic characteristic, it still cannot become a pejorative if it is used as a pejorative. To me, that seems the most reasonable course of action. If something is used as a pejorative in a certain context, and you believe then, after that, that the person who is using it in the situation we're talking about is using it as a pejorative, then it's a pejorative, isn't it? It doesn't need to be an intrinsic characteristic. Notwithstanding that, I do understand and appreciate there is a differentiation made between things which are intrinsic to the person and things which are effectively beliefs, opinions, etc., etc., etc. Notwithstanding that, as a society, we seem to play fast and loose with it, like I say, giving the protections we give to intrinsic characteristics to religions as if religions were intrinsic characteristics when they are not. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to go back to my incredibly bitter fucking homebrew that I have brewed. Cheers.